So recently I started working on a low-level character because I had this whole player covenant idea that I thought would be a fun community event to do sometime in the near future. I was trying to find the best range for this covenant to exist at, so my initial lower bound was about rune level 20 with +3 smithing stones. And while making this build, I frequently opened myself up to invasions because I'd been hearing so much about quote-unquote disgusting twinks at Stormvale and Castle Morn. And when I first heard that, I thought, well, what does a twink even look like in Elden Ring? I also initially brushed off those complaints as people just incessantly complaining about invaders, as they tend to do in these games, but I wanted to see for myself what these supposedly scummy invaders really look like. And what I discovered was a pretty mixed bag of different types of invaders, but essentially, all of them had gear that was obtained later than Castle Morn or Stormvale. But through this experience, I've come to the conclusion that the term twink is rather meaningless in this game outside of some very specific situations, due in large part to the design decisions that FromSoft has made when crafting the open world, but also in their matchmaking design as well. I think there are better ways to describe the rather awful players we encounter a lot of the time, especially at this point in the game's lifecycle. One I've been pondering on for a little while is gear-dependent player, or just GED for short, since I feel like it perfectly describes the real underlying issues with supposed twinking in Elden Ring. And ultimately, the real issue isn't where and when the player got this busted gear that they're using, it's about the busted gear itself that they're using in the first place. What you're seeing in the background here is me building my character at about rune level 16. I knew I wanted to wear the Banished Knight helm, which depicted a dragon on top of it, so I went down to Shifa River to fight the Dragonkin soldier there, which drops the Dragon Halberd. This specific weapon fits perfectly with the aesthetic of the Banished Knight helm, but also apparently is quite a good weapon in its own right. Anyways, this fight took me about 3 tries with a +3 Zweihander, and is quite doable for this level. Now some of you might say, oh, isn't this just you twinking here? And I'd argue it's really not, since I don't even really have to leave Limgrave to access this fight. This is the first boss fight in the game for this character, in case that helps illustrate how nebulous the term twinking is for Elden Ring. I haven't fought Margit or the Leonine Misbegotten or anything like that just yet. Now, some of you newer folks might not totally understand what a twink is, and that's alright, I'll explain it. I'm going to give a brief history of that term first, and also how FromSoftware tried to prevent that, or at least limit it in every game since Dark Souls 1. So if you already know this, you can just go ahead and skip to the timestamp displayed on the screen. The term twink, or the act of twinking, really started in Dark Souls 1, where matchmaking was solely governed by soul level. Certain invaders would essentially stay at a low level, play through extensive portions of the game to get certain gear, and then invade at low levels and annihilate people with said late game gear. This was generally seen as a dick move, since those new players were getting legitimately one-shot by upgraded endgame gear or spells against opponents who could not be staggered, meaningfully damaged, or realistically stopped in any way. Those types of Dark Souls 1 twinks were griefers. That's just what they were, and there's no real way around that. Of course, they changed a lot of that in the Dark Souls remaster, but none of that was done by FromSoftware. And in subsequent games, FromSoft has tried to implement several different features to prevent a Dark Souls 1 type of twinking situation from happening again. In Dark Souls 2, they implemented soul memory, and everybody pretty much hated that. But say what you will about soul memory, it did prevent truly the worst examples of twink invaders at lower levels. In Bloodborne, they just gave up and said, no natural invasions before blood level 30. But then once you got past level 30, you were often in for a world of pain if you got invaded, because people could still come at you with fully upgraded weapons with insane blood gems that were grinded out over countless hours in the Chalice dungeons. So while that did prevent low-level twinking, it wasn't a great overall approach for the entire game's balance and matchmaking. But finally in Dark Souls 3, they implemented weapon-level matchmaking, which made it so that matchmaking was now based off of both your soul level and your weapon upgrades having to be within a certain range of the other player's soul level and weapon upgrades. No longer could you bring a legitimately endgame weapon to lower levels fully upgraded and one-shot people with it. You could still obtain that endgame weapon, but it wouldn't be nearly as dangerous when it had to be within 1 or 2 level upgrades of your opponents. But ultimately, that didn't really solve all of the problems with twinking in Dark Souls 3 either. Players could still run through the rest of the game at low level, collect Estus shards, and upgrade their Estus flasks to the point where in some cases, they would have more Estus flasks available to them than the host they were invading. And each Estus could heal a considerable amount more than the hosts, giving the invader a much larger health pool than the host. Amish made a great video about this if you want to check out just how much of a disparity we're talking about here between non-twinked hosts and twinked invaders. Dark Souls 3 Twinks also had other advantages. They could get their hands on certain weapons like the Dragon Slayer's axe, which pretty much only did absurd damage at lower levels. They could wear rings like the Ring of Favor or the Prisoner's Chain that gave them extra stats. Using those rings, they could then wear heavier armor that had better defenses, making them tankier than their opponents. They could even bring poison to the high wall of Lothric in Undead Settlement, and inflict a status effect that their opponent had no way of curing at that point in the game. Now, the list goes on, but here's the thing. The host party had access to every one of these advantages and more as an overleveled password summon phantom. These phantoms were essentially free to summon, and would only replenish the invader one Estus upon their death, despite the ability to do absurd damage. Additionally, when password summon phantoms were downscaled, they kept several important stats exactly the same, such as their endurance, vitality, which govern equip load at the time, and their FP bar. Essentially, they could wear heavier armor than any invader could at that level, swing their weapon more times than any invader could at that level, and use their weapon arts or spells far more than any invader could at that level. People began to justify their hardcore twinking as a necessity to beat these overleveled phantoms, and at the lowest levels they weren't really wrong. And thus far into the Elden Ring's lifecycle, I've seen that same sentiment carried over from Dark Souls 3. So you might look at all of these instances where FromSoft has made changes to prevent twinking in the past, along with all of the issues with Dark Souls 3's versions of twinking, and say, what did Elden Ring do to solve those? And the answer to that is nothing. The matchmaking system is nearly identical to Dark Souls 3. There is no Estus Flask matchmaking or flags on your character if they've beaten certain late game bosses or obtained late game gear that would prevent you from invading lower levels. Nope, nothing. The only thing that has changed with matchmaking is that now we can't invade solo hosts anymore unless they use the Taunter's Tongue. So why did FromSoft not try to solve any of the issues with DS3's twinking? Because I don't think they see this as that big of an issue. And furthermore, I'm going to make the argument that not only does FromSoft not care in the slightest if you twink in Elden Ring, I'm going to argue that they've made some deliberate choices to give us the tools to twink if we want to. And when twinking is expected, I just don't think it's really twinking anymore. I think it's what I've started to call these types of players, which are gear-dependent players. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to justify any of these things, or even argue that they're a good thing. I'm just trying to interpret FromSoft's intentions based on what they've done with this game versus what they've done with past games. I think gear-dependent players are a lousy part of this community. I think Jeeds look to prey on players who are mostly inexperienced, but also those that are more talented than themselves, with their only advantage being that the gear they've obtained is overpowered. They rely on gimmicks to win, and when those gimmicks fail, you'll very, very frequently see them voluntarily leave your world. But I like the term gear-dependent player because it's all-encompassing. It can refer to players at the lowest of levels using poison and rot on people who can't heal it yet, and it can refer to hosts at the highest level spamming Corpse Piler with 5 blue flasks on hand. Twinking implies a sweatiness and a cruelty that is simply not required to bring overpowered or unfair weapons back to low levels like there were in past games. Using the term twink made more sense when you had to kill multiple late game bosses just to get the infinite invasion item, or the gems that made your Chikage do 1 billion blood tinge damage, or the ring that gives you 15 levels on the cheap. Twinking also implies that the only OP gear in the game lies later in the game, which I'd say in Elden Ring it certainly doesn't. I feel like people get too hung up on where people pick up this incredibly busted gear rather than the fact that it's completely busted. In my last video, the one with the Eclipse Shuttle Invader at rune level 20, I got this one comment about how what's wrong with the Invader is that he went later into the game to get the Glintstone Crowns to perform the swapping heal exploit. And to me that just totally misses the point. The problem isn't that the guy went and got those in Raya Lucaria, it's that there's an exploit that allows you to heal yourself to full in seconds for free. That's the issue I'm talking about here, and that's kind of why I don't love the word twink in this game compared to previous games. The ability to go grab nearly half of the weapons and armor in this game without killing a single boss makes the term twink mean very little to me. The fact that you're able to collect enough golden seeds and secret tears, and then some, in order to get 12 flasks at plus 10 without killing a single boss also makes the term twink mean very little to me. The term twink doesn't matter a ton when you can just go right instead of north and grab relatively overpowered gear for invasions at lower levels immediately. From a merchant in Caelid, you can buy the Nomadic Warriors Cookbook of 15, which lets you craft 10 rot arrows for every 1 Aeonian butterfly you collect, and a few thin beast bones. And you can carry 99 rot arrows at a time. And this is just the first way to grief new players that I thought of off the top of my head. There are much easier way to do this that require even less effort. For example, Blood Ashes of War are insanely easy to obtain early on. In fact, Bloody Slash is actually a pretty good Ash of War in general. You can get Bloody Slash, duplicate it, slap them on a pair of curved swords that you can find practically anywhere, poise up with any number of heavy armor pieces found early on, such as, the Banished Knight set, and your build is already very good. It's all just running L1s and bleed outs. You don't even need the Vare's Mask and the Exaltation Ring? Whatever. Or just do the exact same thing with dual spears. Dual bleed weapons or dual curved swords and spears are already so ridiculously busted that there's no real reason to go out of your way to twink with them because they're already really good. You already have the gear that you depend on before you've even left Limgrave. The open world nature of Elden Ring means we can go a whole variety of places from the very start. So as a result, what gear people are obtaining and when they obtain that gear will greatly differ on a playthrough by playthrough basis. So why are we so obsessed with when players obtain gear in this game? And the reason for that is because we're used to operating under a different system. We're used to Dark Souls 1, 2, 3, and Bloodborne, where you really only had limited options from the start for where you could go. Now that aspect of the game has changed, and I think it's time to update our nomenclature. Oddly enough, the only solution or response FromSoft's game design seems to say about the open world nature of matchmaking and invasions is that as long as it's not happening to solo hosts who don't know how to play the game, they don't care. Because to me, there doesn't seem to be even an attempt at preventing broken gear from being used against low-level players. One type of gear I have not talked about at all yet is late-game armor, which was honestly a much larger deal in Dark Souls 3 than it seems to be in this game. In DS3, the damage dealt in PvP was much lower across the board, especially at lower levels, so the armor you were wearing mattered a whole lot more. Heavier armor provided the best defenses in the game, and thus lower level builds became vigor and vitality gouges, which would make them insanely hard to kill to honest players who simply did not have the damage to put those players away. That's no longer the case in Elden Ring, as even the damage at lower levels is enough to get an invader blendered and killed pretty fast. And the other part of this is that one of the heavier armor sets in the game is obtainable almost right away. On this character I've been using in these invasions, I have 42 poise, wearing a combination of the Banished Knight helm and Banished Knight leggings, Knight gauntlets, and scale armor chest piece that you can buy from the merchant in the Weeping Peninsula. That's a decent amount of poise, enough to tank a one-handed R1 from light weapons, and I didn't even have to go past Stormveil to grab all of it. If I just used the entire Banished Knight set by itself, that would net me 60 poise, which is way more poise than most of my characters have. Due to the increased damage in this game, late game armor at lower levels simply doesn't matter as much as it did in past games, although that may change with any potential DLCs in the future. From Software loves to throw in some ridiculously tanky armor sets into their DLCs, along with their vastly superior weapons. And the Ring City DLC added the Lap set, something that has become a staple for low-level twinks and meta-level players alike due to its abnormally high defenses. Just a little note here, you'll notice that I've done all the invasions up until this point, only having used 2 talisman slots, one filled with Radagon's Sword Seal, and the other with the Arsenal Charm. This entire time, I've been this hideous shade of red, which I really don't like, but that's just because I hadn't gotten that 3rd talisman slot for the host's Trick Mirror, aka the Fashion Ring in this game. At a certain point, I just committed to rune level 25 plus 3. Just those extra 5 levels seemed to get me a lot more activity at Stormveil, which is where I really wanted to be invading for these. So I went and killed Renal and Radon, I got my 3rd talisman slot, and now I can look good while doing these invasions at rune level 25. Anyways, back to the point of this video. Now, I've talked about all of the ways that gear-dependent players could easily get their hands on said busted gear, and use it to curb stomp honest hosts. But what about honest invaders? Back in Dark Souls 3, there was a small movement of certain invaders specifically making honest invaders for places like the woods, as a way to demonstrate that twinking wasn't the end-all be-all of making an invader build in Dark Souls 3. But an honest invader in Elden Ring seems like a concept that simply isn't all that viable. An honest invader for, say, Limgrave wouldn't have access to any rot boluses, and if you've invaded in this game, you know how very often an occurrence it is to have rot breath used against you, due in large part to its massive hitbox and very low stat requirements. But for an honest player at this level, Contracting Scarlet Rot is a death sentence with no way to heal it. The reality is that overleveled summons can use whatever they want and very often choose to use weapons and gear they know to be broken, hence the constant Rivers of Blood spam. And that's okay for them to do, it's their character, it's their choice, but nobody's pretending like this makes them good players. This is made worse by the fact that From Software either can't or is seemingly unwilling to create a proper downscaling algorithm for overleveled summoning players. At all levels, their damage is consistently way too high in a game where damage is already very high across the board. And as a result, many invaders feel like they have to have some of those broken options available to them at those levels in order to counter the absolute might of overleveled summons. So you have invaders with the ability to delete people at the swap of a weapon, and you have overleveled summons who will delete people if given the chance. And then you have the honest hosts and co-opers in the middle who really get the short end of the stick here. FromSoft removed solo host invasions from the equation to prevent them from getting griefed, but in doing so they made their co-op experience a complete mess at lower levels. If this was going to be the reality of invasions at this level, it's odd to me that they didn't just prevent invasions below a level 30 like they did in Bloodborne, when this is going to be so much larger of an issue in such an open game like Elden Ring. I think a more complicated but elegant solution to this would be to gate weapons by having them only be obtainable in an upgraded state. Much like how you can only get Rajer's Rapier at +8, I feel like it would have been a much better idea to make weapons like the Antspur Rapier, the Scorpion Stinger, and the Eclipse Shuttle somewhere around the 10 to 12 range when you pick them up. You could also throw in some other weapons with filthy properties too. Weapons with split damage or poison properties could also sit at +4 or +5 just to prevent them from being used against people around the Church of Ela. I've heard other solutions to this issue that I've liked a lot as well, but the overwhelming approach here by From Software seems to be ambivalence to the issue, and that's just kind of odd to me given all the changes they've made to combat this specific issue over the last 3 to 4 games. I wanted to revisit one of my earlier claims, which was that FromSoft deliberately gave us some of the tools to make powerful low-level builds in this game. So bear with me for a moment. Think back to one of the rings I mentioned earlier as a Twink ring in Dark Souls 3. The Prisoner's Chain in Dark Souls 3 gives you 15 extra levels at the cost of some of your absorption, but also requires you to beat the Dancer of the Boreal Valley, Osiris, and Champion Gundyr, a boss who many would consider one of the toughest bosses in all of Dark Souls 3. Oh, and if you want to actually transpose his soul to get the ring, you need to defeat Vort of the Boreal Valley and the Curse-Rotted Greatwood to get the transposing kill. So, just to recap, that's a ring that gives you extra levels, gated by 2 early game bosses, 2 mid to late game bosses, and a legitimately difficult late game boss. In Elden Ring, the equivalent of the Prisoner's Chain is Radagon's Soreseal, which gives the player 20 extra levels at the cost of a substantial decrease in your absorptions. That ring is gated by some bats in a fort. Some bats in a fort that you can easily run past before they wake up. Oh, and I wonder what else is in this fort that you can reach by just riding Torrent over to it at the start of the game. Oh yeah, it's half of the Dectus Medallion, the other half of which is located in Limgrave, that allows you to ascend the Altus Plateau. Is that gated by anything? Also no, it's just sitting there in a chest, up a ladder. So they put the ring that gives you 20 extra levels in the same location as the item that allows you to reach the mid-game areas. And none of it is gated by a single boss. Now, to me, that all sounds kinda intentional. Like FromSoft wanted to reward players who knew the map well enough, and who were looking to make characters that could wield more weapons from the start of the game. Radagon's Soreseal deliberately gives you 5 points each in both strength and dex, so what better ring to get on a new playthrough that allows you to use more weapons? Now, I'm not implying that FromSoft purposely placed all of these items there specifically so that we could use those items to then grief new players. But I do think they're there to get newer builds off the ground faster, as playthrough variety is greatly improved when you have an immediate boost to the 3 most common limiting stats of wielding new weapons in this game, that being the physical requirements in strength and dex, plus the ability to use that new weapon while light rolling with more endurance. Even then, this seems like kind of a failure on From Software's part, since it seems like your average player simply just keeps leveling up and does their multiple playthroughs on the same character rather than creating new ones. Made clear by how populated rune level 250 plus PvP is compared to something like rune level 60 to 120. But ultimately, the placement of Radagon's Sword Seal and the Dectus Medallion together comes with the byproduct of people using those items to make lower level PvP builds that can use a lot more weapons than before. Now all of a sudden, that 16 strength and 20 dexterity requirement doesn't look so bad for the Cross Naginata, or the 1822 requirement for the Nagakiba. Which is great for us weebs, but is also a boon for Jeeds when the Antspur Rapier's 20 dex requirement is that much easier to hit with the Sword Seal, and all of those extra stats can be dumped right into Vigor, making this character extra tanky. If I'm being honest though, I really like the fact that the Sword Seal is incredibly easy to obtain. It makes making a new, unique build that much easier if you know even kind of what you're doing. And while that's a boon for me, I have to acknowledge it's not a boon for honest co-opers at low levels. FromSoft likely views invaders as the bad guys of the story. They always have. Just look at the factions of the PvP covenants in these games. In Elden Ring, the invasion covenants are either the followers of Mohg's incest dynasty, or the followers of edgy libertarian Vor enthusiasts. They are all always weird, gross, evil people, and that's kind of the point. I don't think that justifies other invaders' scummy usage of broken gear, but I think From Software is entirely aware of this situation and plays into it as well. Elden Ring more than any other game. I don't think that's a good thing. I ultimately made this video to try to redefine how we talk about scummy players that we don't like in this game, and I think gear-dependent players, or Jeeds, is a much more accurate term than Twink. And I don't know if it'll always be more accurate. In future games, Twinks might be a very real thing again, in future games that From Software makes that aren't as open as this one. And don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to tell you guys what to do with all of this either. Twinks can still exist in a lot of ways, I just find the term overused or misused a lot of the time, in this age of the Elden Ring. And because From Software DLCs tend to be the way that they are, if we get one, I expect Twinks to become a bigger problem in the future. For now, I'm going to continue invading and running the Taunter's Tongue around Stormveil at rune level 25 and +3 weapons. I have some pretty fun plans for Stormveil at this range, both on PC and PS4, so stay tuned for that in the hopefully near future. But that's all for me guys, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.